At my family's reunion last August, in the backyard of a house I grew up dreading, my Aunt Miriam introduced me to a woman she had never met before. She pointed at me across the folding table, smiled that wide hostess smile she saves for company, and said, "Oh, that's just Kristin. She's the plain one. Always has been." I was standing 3 feet away, 31 years old, holding a paper plate with potato salad on it, in front of every cousin, uncle and family friend the Hollis name had ever collected in Macon, Georgia. And not one person flinched. Not one person said that is not a kind thing to say. Because to them it was not cruel. It was just a fact. The same fact they had been circulating since I was old enough to understand what the word plain actually meant. But here is what my aunt did not know. The woman she was casually introducing herself to was not a random guest who had wandered in from the neighborhood. And what happened in the next 2 hours did not just embarrass Miriam Hollis in front of 40 people. It dismantled a story my family had been telling about me for 3 decades. And I watched every single second of it from the kids' table where they had seated me. If you have ever been the member of your family that everyone looks through instead of at, this story is for you. And if you are new here, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because we tell stories on this channel that do not flinch from the truth. Real families, real moments, real reckonings. Now let me take you back to where this all started. I was 7 years old the first time I understood what plain meant in the Hollis household. It was Easter Sunday. My mother, Miriam Hollis, had taken my older sister Dara and me to a department store in downtown Macon the Saturday before to pick out dresses. Dara was 10, brown-eyed, with the kind of natural confidence that made strangers stop and comment wherever she went. My mother moved through that store with Dara like they were shopping for a pageant, which in a way they always were. Dara tried on 6 dresses. My mother assessed each one the way a jeweler examines a stone, turning her, stepping back, tilting her head with great consideration. "This one makes your eyes pop," she said. "This one is too busy, it distracts from your face. Your face should always be the centerpiece, Dara." Eventually they settled on a pale blue dress with eyelet trim. My mother called it perfect. Then it was my turn. My mother flipped through the rack with considerably less ceremony. She pulled out a yellow dress with a white sash and held it against me for approximately 4 seconds. "This will do," she said. "Not this makes your eyes pop. Not your face is the centerpiece. This will do." I wore the yellow dress on Easter Sunday. In the photos from that morning, Dara is centered, smiling, lit up like the whole point of the holiday. I am standing slightly behind her, one shoulder dipped, the white sash already coming loose at the back. I'm not ugly in those photos. I'm just there. Present but incidental, like the basket of artificial grass sitting on the table behind us. That was the beginning of the label. "This will do." That phrase, more than any single cruel word, became the foundation of how my mother saw me. Dara got chosen. I got adequate. Dara got the carefully considered dress. I got the one that would do. The label, once it existed, spread through the family the way mold spreads through an old house. Quietly, comprehensively, until it was in every room. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a sharp-tongued woman named Estelle who ran her household like a particularly unforgiving school principal, had a habit of ranking her grandchildren in casual conversation as though she were discussing the weather. "Dara is the beauty of this family," she would announce to anyone who visited. Then she would gesture in my general direction with her sweet tea glass and add, "Kristin is the sensible one." Which sounds like a compliment until you understand that in Estelle's vocabulary, sensible was the category you placed people in when you could not find anything prettier to say about them. My cousin Boone was the funny one. My cousin Leah was the sweet one. My brother Ray, 4 years younger than me, was the athletic one. Every person in that family got a quality, a feature, a selling point that people remembered. And mine, assembled by committee sometime around my 8th birthday, was plain. Not plain spoken, not plain sensible, just plain. As in, nothing particularly worth noticing here. As in, look at Dara instead. Here is what the label did over time. It did not just change how my family saw me. It changed what they offered me. Dara got enrolled in a local theater program at 11 because my mother said she had natural presence and the world needed to see it. I asked to join the following year. My mother said it was expensive and left it at that, moving on to the next topic before I could finish my sentence. Dara got new clothes at the start of every school year, a ritual my mother treated with genuine investment, picking colors that suited her complexion, avoiding patterns that overwhelmed her features. I got what was left in the budget, which was usually a trip to the clearance rack at the tail end of August, rifling through what other families had passed over. My mother was not deliberately cruel. That is the part that took me the longest to understand and the longest to stop making excuses for. She was not plotting against me. She simply had a fixed and settled idea of what each of her children was, and she allocated her time, her attention, and her energy accordingly. Dara was an investment. I was maintenance. School did what schools always do. It reinforced everything already decided at home. Dara was 2 years ahead of me, which meant every teacher I got had already had her first. And every teacher had already formed a category before I sat down in their classroom. "Oh, you are Dara Hollis's sister," said with that particular lilt that means I have high expectations. Followed, usually within a semester, by a quieter and more private recalibration. "You are very different from your sister, aren't you?" I was different from my sister. I was quieter, more internal. I did not raise my hand in class because I had learned somewhere around the 3rd grade that when I spoke, the room did not respond the way it did when Dara spoke. Dara talked and people leaned forward. I talked and people nodded politely and looked back at whatever they had been doing before. So I stopped talking in rooms that did not listen. I started writing instead. By the time I was 12, I had filled 4 composition notebooks with stories. Not diary entries. Not journal thoughts. Actual stories with characters who had names and full histories and complicated problems that needed resolving across multiple chapters. I wrote about women who built things from nothing, who traveled to places alone, who walked into rooms and changed the temperature just by being present. I wrote about people who had been invisible for years and then were suddenly, finally, undeniably seen. I did not share any of it with my family. My mother's reaction to my writing, on the one occasion I made the mistake of showing her a story in 6th grade, was a gentle and complete variation of the phrase she had been using since the yellow Easter dress. "That is nice, Kristin." She handed it back without finishing the 2nd page. That was the last time I offered my family anything I created. By 16 I had a system. I kept my accomplishments the way some people keep their most private feelings, quietly, carefully, in a place where no one could pick them up and find them merely adequate. I won a regional writing competition in 10th grade. 1st place, out of over 200 entries across 12 counties in Middle Georgia. The prize was a $50 gift card and a certificate with my name printed in gold letters. I placed the certificate in my desk drawer underneath my composition notebooks where no one would accidentally find it. I used the gift card to buy more notebooks. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Dara. I did not mention it at dinner. Because I already knew the precise shape of what would happen if I did. It would be brief and gentle and painless in the way that only truly indifferent responses can be painless. It would land like a pebble dropped into a very deep well. A small sound and then nothing. What I did not know at 16, sitting alone in my bedroom in Macon with a gold certificate face down in a drawer, was that I was already building something that none of them could see yet. Not the kind of thing you frame and hang above a sofa. The kind of thing that takes a decade of quiet, unglamorous, unwitnessed work before it becomes visible from the outside. I was building a voice. A real one. The kind that grows in rooms where nobody is paying attention, fed by years of being overlooked and underfunded and left to figure things out without applause. And voices like that, once they are fully formed, do not stay contained. They find their way out. Mine was going to find its way out on a Saturday afternoon in August, in a backyard full of people who had spent 31 years filing me under plane and moving on. And the woman standing next to my Aunt Miriam when she said it that afternoon, the woman with the slim leather notebook and the small recorder tucked into the front pocket of her bag, the woman who had driven 2 hours south from Atlanta specifically to find me, she had an entirely different word for what I was. And she was about to say it clearly and calmly and loudly enough for every single person in that backyard to hear. I left Macon at 18 with a single duffel bag, a Greyhound ticket, and a full academic scholarship to the University of Georgia in Athens. My mother's response when I told her was 4 words delivered over the kitchen sink while she was rinsing a colander. "That is far away." Not "congratulations." Not "I am proud of you." Not "we should celebrate." "That is far away," spoken in the same flat tone she used when she noted the gas prices had gone up or that it might rain on the weekend. Dara, who had chosen a cosmetology program 20 minutes from home 2 years earlier, got a going-away dinner at her favorite restaurant with the whole extended family present. I got 4 words over a colander and a Tupperware container of peanut butter cookies my father quietly pressed into my hands the morning the bus came. My father, Dale Hollis, was a man who expressed everything through small gestures because large ones had never been modeled for him. He was present in the room but consistently overruled. A man who had spent 20 years married to Miriam, learning that his observations were tolerated but his opinions were negotiable. He packed those cookies himself. I could tell by the way they were stacked, imprecise and lopsided, nothing like my mother's precise rows. He handed them to me at the door and said, "Call when you get there." But he stood on the front porch and watched the car until it rounded the corner. I saw him in the side mirror, still standing there with his hands in his pockets, still watching long after he needed to. Athens was the first place I had ever lived where nobody knew what I was before they met me. No teacher had already filed me under Dara Hollis's quieter sister. No neighbor had a fixed idea of my ceiling. No family friend would tilt their head and say sensible the way they said it back home, like a consolation prize at the end of a competition I had never been allowed to formally enter. In Athens I was just Kristin. And Kristin, it turned out, had quite a few things to say. I declared an English major with a concentration in creative writing. My first workshop professor, a tall, unhurried woman named Dr. Okafor, who wore the same gray cardigan to every class and had published 3 novels nobody outside of academic circles had heard of, read my first submitted story and wrote one sentence in red ink at the top of the final page. "You have a real instinct for what people do not say out loud." I read that sentence 6 times in the parking lot outside the English building. I had spent 16 years in a house where what people did not say out loud was the entire language of the family. Of course I had an instinct for it. I had been fluent in it since I was 7 years old, standing in a department store in a yellow dress. By junior year I was submitting work to literary magazines. Small ones at first, university publications and regional journals, the kind that pay in contributor copies and a line on your resume that nobody outside the industry would recognize. I got rejected 41 times before my first acceptance. I kept every rejection letter in a folder on my laptop labeled simply "not yet." Because that is what they were. They were not a verdict. They were not "you are inadequate." They were not "this will do." They were "not yet," which meant the door was still standing and I had simply not found the right angle of approach. My 41st submission, a short story about a woman renovating a condemned house in a small Georgia town who discovers the original owner's letters sealed inside the walls, was accepted by a literary journal out of Nashville called The Southern Current. They sent me a check for $85 and published my name in print for the first time. I framed the table of contents page. I hung it above my desk where I would see it every morning when I sat down to write. Some people need reminders that they belong. That page was mine. I did not tell my mother about the publication. By then the habit of not sharing had become so deeply grooved that withholding felt more natural than disclosing. I had learned that sharing accomplishments with my family was not an exchange. It was a deposit into an account that never acknowledged the transaction. So I kept the check, hung the frame, and started the next story. I graduated in 3.5 years summa cum laude. My father came to the ceremony alone. He told me 2 weeks before that my mother had a prior commitment. A phrase she used as a soft landing for something that did not require softening, because the honest truth was simply that she did not come. My father sat in the 3rd row in the one blazer he owned, the navy one he wore to every formal occasion, and when they called my name and I walked across that stage, I heard him from 3 rows back above every other sound in that building. Not polite applause. The kind that comes from someone who has been quietly storing something up for a long time and finally has a reason to release it. I found him afterward in the lobby. He was holding his phone at an awkward angle trying to photograph my diploma. I took the phone, handed it to a stranger, and made them take a picture of both of us together. My father in his navy blazer, his hand on my shoulder, his jaw set in that particular way of a man determined not to cry in a building full of people he did not know. That photograph lived on my refrigerator for 6 years. It was the only family photo I owned that I had actively chosen to display. The years after graduation moved the way productive years always do, fast when you are inside them and only measurable when you turn around and look at the distance covered. I moved to Atlanta at 23 for a junior editorial position at a regional magazine called Georgia Living, the kind of publication that profiles local restaurant openings and writes features on interesting people doing quietly remarkable things in small towns across the state. It was not the literary work I had imagined when Dr. Okafor wrote in my margins. But it was a room full of people who used words professionally, and I absorbed everything I could. I learned how a story gets pitched, how it gets shaped for an audience, how the difference between a piece that moves people and one that merely informs them lives in one specific true detail so precise it makes a reader feel they were in the room when it happened. I wrote about a 90-year-old woman in Valdosta who had been cultivating the same variety of heirloom tomato since 1963 and had never once written the process down. I wrote about a coach in Albany who had been quietly covering his players' unpaid school fees out of his own salary for 11 years without telling anyone. I wrote about a diner in Statesboro that had not changed its menu since 1987 and had a waiting list for Sunday breakfast that stretched out the front door. Every story I wrote was about someone doing something significant in a space where nobody had thought to look. Looking back, that was never coincidental. I had always been drawn to the things other people walked past. By 27 I had moved from staff writer to senior features editor. By 29 I had placed 2 long-form pieces in publications well beyond Georgia Living's reach. One in a respected quarterly out of New York and one in a nationally distributed magazine I had been reading since my freshman year of college. My byline was building a certain kind of weight. Not the kind that puts your face on a billboard. The kind that makes editors nod when they see your name on a pitch and say she delivers. That kind builds slowly and holds longer, and I had been building it in complete silence as far as my family was concerned. The reunion was my father's idea. He called on a Sunday evening in June later than his usual time, and I knew from the delay that he had been thinking about how to bring it up. "Your mother is doing the reunion again in August," he said. "Pause. Then I would like it if you came. I want you there. Not your mother wants you there. Not the family has been asking. I want you there." 4 words from Dale Hollis carried more weight than anything my mother had said to me in the previous 10 years. I told him I would come. What I did not tell him was that I had spent the past 3 months corresponding with a journalist named Sheila Marsh who was developing a long-form feature on emerging Southern voices in literary nonfiction and had identified my work as central to the piece. I had mentioned to Sheila, almost in passing, that I would be in Macon in August for a family event. She replied that she knew Macon, that she might find herself in the area that same weekend. I had not given it much thought after that. People say they might be in the area the same way they say we should catch up soon. It almost never becomes a fact. I should have known better than to apply that assumption to Sheila Marsh. Sheila Marsh had a reputation in Atlanta journalism circles that preceded her into every room she entered. She was 44, had spent 12 years at a major Southern publication before going independent, and was known specifically for writing profiles that found the person underneath the resume, the texture of someone's actual life rather than the curated version they presented at professional events. She was not the kind of journalist who called something emerging and meant it as a soft compliment. When she used that word, she meant something specific. She meant a force still gathering itself, not yet fully visible, but unmistakable to anyone paying close enough attention. She had emailed me first. Out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning in April, a message in my work inbox addressed directly to me with a subject line that said simply, "Your piece on the Albany coach. Won't talk." I read that email 4 times before I responded. I was not used to being the one someone came looking for. The drive from Atlanta to Macon on a Saturday morning in August takes just under 90 minutes if you leave before the heat settles fully into the highway. I left at 7. I needed the extra time not for traffic but for the mental preparation that going home has always required. The slow, deliberate process of reminding myself that I was no longer the girl who lived there, that I was returning to a place that had a fixed idea of me, and that the fixed idea was wrong, and that its being wrong was not something I needed to prove to anyone in that backyard. I had been telling myself that last part for years. I was still not entirely sure I believed it. I pulled into my parents' street at 8:45. The reunion did not officially start until noon, but my mother had always run these events the way a director runs a production. With a full setup window she treated as sacred and a clear hierarchy of who was expected to arrive early and assist. Dar would be there by 9. Dar was always there by 9. I parked 2 houses down, sat in the car for a few minutes and looked at the house I grew up in. White siding, green shutters, the oak tree in the front yard that had been losing the same low branch for as long as I could remember and had somehow never fully lost it. The porch light was still on even in the morning. My mother always forgot to turn it off. My father was on the back porch when I came through the side gate. He was setting up folding tables, working slowly because of the stiffness in his left shoulder that had never fully resolved after a fall 2 winters ago. He was moving with the careful, deliberate effort of a man who refuses to ask for help not out of pride but out of habit, the deep-settled habit of a person who has always done things alone. He saw me come through the gate and stopped. He did not say anything. He just looked at me the way you look at something you were not expecting to see and are quietly glad about. Then he handed me the other end of the table he was unfolding. We set up 4 tables without exchanging more than a dozen words. It was the most comfortable I had felt in months. Dara arrived at 9:15 with her husband, 2 kids, and the particular energy she brought to every family event. The energy of someone who has been the centerpiece of every room they have ever entered and fully expects that to continue. She was wearing a sundress that my mother immediately complimented twice in the first 3 minutes. Dar, that color is just perfect on you. Then a pause, then Kristin, you look nice too, delivered in the same tone my mother used when she said the weather was supposed to be decent. Technically positive. Completely without investment. I said thank you and went back to setting up chairs. By 11:30 the yard was filling. The extended Hollis family has a reach that I have always found slightly staggering given how little warmth circulates at the center of it. Cousins I see once a year. Aunts who remember me primarily as the child who was hard to photograph well. My uncle Garrett, who has been telling the same 3 stories at every reunion since 1998. And my Aunt Patrice, Miriam's sister, a woman who operates entirely on social performance, who enters every gathering as though she has been specifically invited to assess it and report back to some higher authority on the quality of the spread. I found a spot near the back fence and stayed close to it. A strategy one developed in my mid-20s, the tactical selection of a position at family events that gives you a clear view of the entire yard, reasonable proximity to the food, and a natural exit path that does not require passing the main table. My father knew where I was. He checked on me twice before noon, each time under cover of some small practical task, refilling the ice in the cooler near the fence, adjusting the umbrella above the table closest to where I was standing. Each time he passed he said nothing. Each time I felt him say everything. My mother had arranged the main table seating with the precision she applies to anything she considers a reflection of her own standing. She and Patrice sat at the center. Dara and her husband Marcus were to her left. The chairs around that cluster filled quickly with cousins and relatives who had always orbited my mother and Dara the way smaller objects orbit larger ones. I was not at the main table. There was no card with my name on it. When I walked the length of it before lunch just to confirm what I already knew, my name was not there. I found a seat at the secondary table, the one positioned slightly off-center from the main gathering, where the overflow went, where you ended up when the main arrangement did not have room for you. I sat next to a cousin's husband named Todd, a quiet civil engineer from Savannah who had also clearly not been given a seat at the main table and was handling it by eating his potato salad with the focused composure of a man who had decided not to make it mean anything. I respected that entirely. The afternoon had its own rhythm, the same one every Hollis reunion has run on for as long as I can remember. My mother circulated between tables performing warmth at varying volumes. Dara held court at the center, periodically refreshing the attention directed at her by introducing new topics. Her upcoming vacation. A renovation to the master bathroom. A course her eldest had completed. My Aunt Patrice moved through the yard the way she always did, commenting on everything and landing nowhere. The afternoon was an old familiar machine running exactly as it had always run. And then a car pulled up to the front of the house. I heard the side gate first, its specific creak that I had been hearing since childhood, and I looked up to see a woman I did not recognize stepping into the backyard with the careful attentiveness of someone entering a space they had not been to before. She was in her mid-40s, dressed practically but with a considered quality to it, dark slacks, a light jacket despite the August heat, a canvas bag over one shoulder with a recorder and notebook visible inside. She scanned the yard the way a journalist scans a room, not looking for a familiar face but reading the geography of the space before deciding where to position herself within it. It was Selah Marsh. She had actually come. She spotted me within 30 seconds, which told me she had done enough research to know what I looked like before she arrived. She walked directly toward me without stopping to introduce herself to anyone else, which in a yard full of people who operate entirely on social protocol was its own kind of statement. She moved like someone who was not interested in the performance currently running and was interested only in finding the person she had come specifically to see. So I said, "It actually came." She sat in the empty chair beside me without being invited to, which I found immediately comfortable. She set her bag on the table and looked around the yard with an expression I recognized from years of doing this work myself, the expression of someone absorbing detail rapidly and filing it without appearing to. I see why you did not go into too much detail about this in your emails, she said. I told her she had no idea. She said, I think I might have a better idea than you think. We talked for 20 minutes, volume low, attention focused. She asked about the Albany coach piece, what had drawn me to it, how I had gotten him to open up, whether I had known going in what the real story was or whether it had surfaced during the reporting. I answered honestly because that is the only way I know how to answer questions about work I care about. She listened the way good journalists listen, without interrupting, without redirecting, without performing engagement. She was actually present, which was more than I could say for most of the people at the main table 20 feet away. I was absorbed enough in the conversation that I did not notice my Aunt Patrice approaching until she was already at the edge of the table. Patrice had the radar that certain people develop after decades of being the dominant presence in every room they enter, an antenna tuned to any deviation from the established order. A well-dressed stranger in close conversation with the family's plain one was a significant deviation. She arrived with her hostess expression loaded and her sweet tea in hand, looked at Selah the way she looked at anything not yet categorized, and extended her hand with the warmth she reserved for people she considered worth impressing. Then she turned toward me, barely the way you turn toward something in your peripheral vision, and with the easy confidence of someone who has said a thing so many times it no longer registers as a choice, she said it. When this is Kristin. She's the plain one. Always has been. A small laugh followed, warm and conspiratorial, the laugh of someone sharing a harmless family anecdote, the laugh of someone who had no idea that the woman sitting across the table made her living finding the true story underneath the one people performed for company. Selah did not laugh. She looked at my Aunt Patrice with an expression I will not forget. Not anger. Not shock. The calm, unhurried attention of someone who has just been handed exactly the information she needed and is deciding, quietly and without urgency, precisely what to do with it. Selah let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. I counted them the way you count seconds after lightning, waiting to see how close the storm actually is. Then she set her sweet tea down on the table with the deliberate care of someone putting down something they no longer want to be holding, folded her hands in front of her, and looked at my Aunt Patrice with the full and undivided attention that I had watched her turn on interview subjects earlier in our conversation. It was the kind of attention that does not feel like a compliment when you are on the receiving end of it. Feels like being read. I'm sorry, Selah said. Her voice was even and clear and carried just far enough. Could you say that again? I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Patrice had spent 40 years being the most socially agile person in any room she entered. She recovered fast. She laughed again, lighter this time, recalibrating. Oh, it is just a family expression. We are a funny bunch, the Hollises. Every family has their little nicknames. She waved her hand in the air, the same dismissive wave I had watched her deploy my entire life. The gesture that meant this does not require further examination, move along. She looked at me briefly as though I might corroborate the story. I did not say a word. Selah nodded slowly. She reached into her canvas bag and removed her notebook. Not the recorder. Just the notebook. She opened it to a page already covered in neat handwriting and clicked her pen. I had interviewed enough people alongside her work to know what that gesture meant. It meant she was treating this conversation as on the record. Not because she planned to quote my Aunt Patrice in a magazine feature. Because she had decided that the dynamics she had just witnessed were relevant to the story she was writing, and the story she was writing was about me. My mother appeared at the edge of the secondary table approximately 90 seconds after Patrice arrived, which told me she had been watching from a distance and had clocked the deviation the same moment Patrice had. My mother had always maintained a quiet surveillance of any social situation she was hosting. She moved through her own gatherings the way a property manager moves through a building they own, checking every room, noting anything out of order. A stranger at the secondary table with a notebook out was very much out of order. She arrived with her hostess smile fully assembled, the one that shows all her front teeth and does not touch her eyes. She looked at Selah first, assessing, then at me with the particular look she reserved for moments when I had introduced an unexpected variable into a situation she had planned. Who is your friend, Kristin? She said the word friend the way she had been saying every word about me my entire life, with a slight emphasis that made it sound like a question she already knew the answer to and did not consider interesting. Before I could respond, Selah stood up from her chair. She was not significantly taller than my mother, but she stood the way people stand when they have spent years speaking in front of rooms full of strangers and have stopped being nervous about taking up space. She extended her hand. Miriam Hollis. I've been hoping to meet you. My name is Selah Marsh. I am a journalist. I am currently working on a feature for a nationally distributed publication about some of the most significant literary voices to come out of the American South in the past decade. She paused exactly one beat. Your daughter Kristin is the centerpiece of that piece. The yard did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in concentric circles the way sound travels from a point of impact. The people closest to our table first, then the next table over, then the cluster near the grill, then the cousins at the far end of the yard. Within 45 seconds the Bluetooth speaker was still playing but nobody was listening to it anymore. My mother's smile stayed in place. It was impressive, the structural integrity of that smile under pressure. She had built it over decades and it held. Well, she said, "How lovely." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not pride, not warmth, something more complicated and considerably less comfortable. Something that looked like a person encountering a version of a story they thought they knew and realizing mid-sentence that they had the facts wrong. Selah did not give the smile time to settle into a performance. She opened her notebook to a clean page, clicked her pen again, and said to my mother with the polite directness of someone who interviews people for a living and has learned that the most efficient path through social armor is a specific and concrete question. I have been corresponding with Kristin for several months about her body of work. Her piece on the coach in Albany was nominated for a regional journalism award earlier this year. Did she mention that to you? She had not mentioned it to me either. I had not known. I looked at Selah. She glanced at me sideways, a brief look that communicated simultaneously, "I just found that out this morning and I thought you should hear it in front of them." My mother's smile flickered for the first time. Just at the edges. Just for a second. "No," she said. He did not mention it. My Aunt Patrice had been standing at the table this entire time. She had the expression of someone who arrived at a party expecting to be the most interesting person in the room and discovered approximately 4 minutes in that the room had already organized itself around someone else entirely. She opened her mouth once. She closed it. She looked at me the way she had been looking at me since I was 7 years old. That same appraising half-focused look that had always communicated that she was seeing a category rather than a person. Except now the category had shifted underneath her and she had not been given time to file it correctly. Selah kept going. She was not performing. She was not raising her voice or building to a dramatic moment. She was simply delivering information the way a good journalist delivers information, factually, sequentially, in a register that made it impossible to dismiss without appearing to actively resist the truth. She told my mother that the long-form piece on emerging Southern voices had been in development for 8 months. That my Albany Coach article had been what initially drew her attention to my work. That after reading back through my byline archive she had found 17 substantial pieces over a 6-year period that she described in exactly these words, as some of the most precise and emotionally intelligent narrative nonfiction currently being produced in this region. 17 pieces. I had never counted them. I had just written the next one every time I finished the last one. Dara had drifted over from the main table. I saw her arrive at the edge of the gathering that had formed around our table and stay there, arms crossed, weight shifted onto one hip, the posture she had always assumed when something was happening that she had not been invited to be the center of. She was watching my mother's face more than she was listening to Selah, which told me she was reading the situation the same way she had always read situations, by tracking whose position in the hierarchy was moving and in which direction. Selah reached into her canvas bag and removed a printed page. She set it on the table and smoothed it flat. It was a mock layout of the feature, not a finished version but a working draft, the kind a journalist carries to a subject interview to convey the seriousness of the publication commitment. My name was at the top. A photograph of me I did not remember being taken was positioned where the header image would go. I was sitting at my desk in the Georgia living office looking at something off camera, my expression entirely unguarded, the face of someone completely absorbed in what they are doing and completely unaware of being watched. I did not know who had taken it. It did not look like a posed photograph. It looked like a true one. "This is the working draft of the layout," Selah said to the table at large, to the 12 or 15 people now gathered within clear listening distance of our conversation. "The piece runs in the winter issue. We anticipate it will be one of the most read features of the quarter." She looked at my mother then, directly, in the way she had looked at Patrice when she asked her to repeat herself. Not unkindly. with the plain, steady directness of someone who has decided that the most respectful thing she can do in this moment is simply tell the truth. I drove down from Atlanta today because Kristin mentioned she would be here and I wanted to go over the layout proofs with her in person. She paused. I also wanted to meet the family that produced a writer this good. I assumed you would know about the work. Most families do. 6 words at the end, delivered without inflection, without editorial weight. I assumed you would know. They landed on that secondary table in a backyard in Macon, Georgia, in the middle of a family reunion that had been running the same script for 30 years. And for the first time in all of those years the script did not have a next line. My mother stood with her hands at her sides and her smile entirely gone. Not replaced by tears, not replaced by anger. Replaced by the expression of a person who has just been shown, in front of 40 people who have known her for decades, that the story she had been telling about her family contained a significant and public error. The kind of error that cannot be quietly corrected in a private conversation after everyone has gone home. The kind that simply exists now, out in the open in the August afternoon light, next to the potato salad and the cooling grill and the Bluetooth speaker that was still playing to nobody. I did not look away from her. For the first time in 31 years I did not look away. The first person to speak after my mother's smile disappeared was not my mother. It was not Patrice. It was not Dara, who was still standing at the edge of the gathering with her arms crossed and her jaw set in that fixed position she took whenever a situation had moved outside her control. It was my Uncle Garrett, who had been sitting 2 tables away eating a second plate of brisket and had wandered over during Sela's delivery without anyone noticing. Garrett was 63, had worked for the same insurance company in Macon for 31 years. And was not a man given to dramatic statements. He looked at the printed layout on the table, looked at my name at the top of the page and said in the same unhurried voice he used to tell his reunion stories, "Well, I'll be. That's our Kristin." He said it the way you state a fact you are pleased to have confirmed. Then he went back to his brisket. It was the most uncomplicated response in the yard and somehow the one that landed the hardest of all. My mother recovered her voice approximately 30 seconds later. The recovery was not graceful but it was fast, which was consistent with everything I had ever known about her. Miriam Hollis did not stay exposed for long. She had a reflex for it, decades of social calibration that fired before an honest response could fully form. "Well, of course we are proud of Kristin," she said. Her voice had the bright, brittle quality it got when she was performing for an audience she did not entirely trust. She looked at Sela with the smile reloaded, smaller this time, more controlled. "We have always supported her work. She has always had our full support." Sela wrote something in her notebook without looking up. My mother watched the pen move and said nothing else. It was Dara who moved first from her position at the edge of the gathering. She walked to the table and sat down directly across from me, not next to my mother, not beside Patrice, directly across from me, which was a choice I noticed and filed quietly. She looked at the layout page for a long moment. She looked at the photograph of me at my desk, unguarded and absorbed, looking at something outside the frame. She was quiet for longer than I had ever seen Dar be quiet at a family event in my life. Then she said, "You never told me about any of this." It was not an accusation. It was something closer to recognition, the sound of someone beginning to understand a pattern they had been standing too close to see for years. "You never said anything," she repeated, quieter the second time. "I told you about the Albany piece at Christmas 2 years ago," I said. "You were on your phone." She looked at her hands on the table. I remembered that dinner clearly, the good china my mother only brought out for large gatherings, the space between the salad course and the main where I had mentioned the story while it was still warm in my mind. Dara had said without looking up from her screen. I had not tried again after that. She did not respond to what I said. She just sat with her hands in front of her in the way people sit when they are quietly recalibrating something they believed was already finished and permanent. My Aunt Patrice had been uncharacteristically silent since Sela opened her notebook. Patrice operated best when the social current ran in her direction, when she was setting the tone and the room was adjusting itself around her. The notebook had reversed that current completely and she had not found her footing. She was standing slightly apart from the table, her sweet tea held in both hands like a prop she no longer knew how to use. Then she made her attempt. She stepped forward and turned toward Sela with her hostess warmth reloaded. "You know," she said, "I have always told Miriam that Kristin has a gift. I have been saying that for years." Sela looked up from her notebook. She looked at Patrice with the same even and unhurried expression she had used when she asked her to repeat herself 20 minutes earlier. Not anger. just full, undivided presence. She said, "That is interesting. Because about 20 minutes ago you introduced her to me as the plain one." She let that sentence sit exactly as long as it needed to. Then she looked back down and continued writing without further comment. Patrice's face moved through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 2 seconds. In 40 years of watching her work a room, I had never seen her without the right expression assembled and ready. She looked at my mother. My mother looked at the tablecloth. Neither of them produced a word. It was Todd, the civil engineer from Savannah, still at the secondary table where he had been eating quietly through the entire unfolding, who broke the silence. He had been so still throughout that I had nearly forgotten he was there. He looked at me and said, "You wrote the piece about the Albany coach? The one that ran in Georgia Living last spring?" I read that. He paused. "That was a really good piece." His wife beside him gave the confirming nod of someone who had also read it and fully agreed. It was the most ordinary possible response to everything that had just happened, and it was the one that tightened something in my chest in a way I had not prepared for. Not the journalist with the notebook. Not the confrontation at the table. 2 people at the secondary table saying quietly and without agenda, "We read your work," and meaning every word of it. That was the thing that got me. My mother excused herself from the main area 10 minutes later, attaching a practical reason to the exit the way she always did. She said she needed to check on the dessert table. She walked across the yard with her shoulders straight and her chin level, the posture of a woman who has not yet decided whether the story of this afternoon will be one she eventually acknowledges or one she files in the category of things that did not officially happen. I watched her cross the grass. I did not follow. Selah stayed at the secondary table with me for another full hour going over the layout proofs the way she had originally driven down to do. It was a working conversation, professional and focused, and I was grateful for the ordinariness of it after everything that had preceded it. The family continued to move around us in the background, reorganizing into smaller clusters, running the side conversations that happen after something has fundamentally shifted the temperature of a room and nobody wants to be the first to name what changed. Things happened in that hour I had not anticipated. My cousin Renata, who I had not spoken to in 2 years, quietly brought her chair to the edge of our table and sat without being asked, not interrupting, just present in a way that felt entirely deliberate. Dara's eldest, a teenager named Cole, wandered over and asked Selah what a features editor actually did for a living. She explained it plainly, and he listened with the focused attention of someone encountering a career he had not previously known existed. When she finished, he looked at me. "Did you always want to do this, Aunt Kristin?" I told him I had always wanted to write. The rest of it came from finding the right room. He nodded the way people nod when something becomes more than just an answer to a question. I genuinely hoped it stayed with him beyond the afternoon. Dara came back to the table once more before the gathering ended. She sat beside me this time instead of across from me, and that small difference in position was not lost on either of us. She did not offer a prepared speech. She said, "I should have listened at Christmas. That is all." Just that, plainly. I should have listened. I told her yes. We sat together without filling the space with anything else for a few minutes, and it was more honest than any conversation we had managed between us in a very long time. My father found me near the oak tree as the afternoon light began its slow tilt toward evening. He crossed the uneven grass carefully with his cane and sat in the chair beside mine without ceremony or preamble. He said, "That Selah seems like a good person." I told him she was. He said, "She drove a long way to say true things about you in front of the right people." I told him that was about as accurate a summary as I had heard all day. He looked at his hands resting on the cane. Then he said, "I have been wanting someone to say true things about you in this yard for a very long time." His voice carried no drama. It was tired and completely honest in the particular way of someone who has held something quietly for years without saying it and is finally setting it down somewhere visible. I placed my hand over his on the cane and we sat in the changing light without saying anything more. The silence between us was the most comfortable thing I had felt since I pulled into that street that morning. Selah left before dinner. She shook my hand at the gate, told me the final proofs would reach me by email the following week, and offered one last thing before getting in her car. She said, "For what it is worth, none of what happened today surprised me." I asked her what she meant. She said, "People who do the kind of work you do and the kind of quiet you have done it in, there is almost always a room somewhere that has been carrying the wrong story about them." She pulled out of the street and drove north toward Atlanta. I stood at the gate and looked back at the yard, at the family still scattered across the grass, at the long August light falling over everything that had been said and left unsaid in that space. I felt something I did not have an immediate clean word for. Not triumph. Not vindication. Something quieter than both and considerably more durable. The particular stillness that settles into a space after a sound that has been running for a very long time finally, completely stops. I drove back to Atlanta that night instead of staying over the way my father had asked me to. He did not push when I said I needed to get back. He stood at the door with his cane and watched me load my bag into the car the same way he had watched the bus pull from the curb 13 years earlier, with the steady patient expression of a man who has accepted that the people he loves most have always needed more room than this house could give them. I hugged him at the door. He held on a beat longer than usual. I told him I would call Sunday at 7. He said he would be there. I did not say goodbye to my mother. She was in the kitchen when I left, standing at the counter with her back to the hallway, rinsing dishes with the focused, deliberate energy of a person who has decided that productivity is the most dignified available response to a difficult afternoon. I could see her through the doorway. She did not turn around. I do not know whether she heard me leave or simply chose not to acknowledge it. With my mother, the line between those two things had always been invisible. I did not say goodbye to Dara either. She had left an hour earlier, loading the minivan with leftover Tupperware and borrowed folding chairs with the efficiency of a woman wrapping up an event she had not expected to end the way it did. Before she drove away, she had come back to the table and placed her hand briefly on my shoulder without saying anything. Just her hand for 3 seconds and then she was gone. It was the most physical contact Dara and I had exchanged in years. I registered it and did not comment. Some things are too fragile for immediate examination. The highway back to Atlanta was quiet the way August highways get after 9 in the evening, the heat finally releasing its grip on the asphalt, the sky going from amber to a soft flat dark. I drove with the windows down for the first 40 miles and let the air do what it does, clear the residue of a day that had too many layers to carry all at once. I thought about the layout page in my bag on the passenger seat. My name at the top. The photograph of me at my desk, unaware of the camera, completely absorbed in the work. I had not staged it. I had not known it was being taken. And it was the truest image of me that had ever existed in any publication, not because of how I looked but because I looked like myself. A person in the middle of something that matters to them, unbothered by whether anyone was watching. That was the photograph Selah had chosen to represent me. Not a headshot. Not a posed portrait. A photograph of me doing the work. That choice told me more about how she understood my career than anything she had said at the secondary table. 3 weeks after the reunion, the final proofs arrived by email. I read the piece twice before responding. It was the most accurate thing ever written about my work, not because it was flattering but because it was true. It captured the Albany piece the way the Albany piece had captured its subject, from the inside out. Selah had written that my particular gift as a journalist was my refusal to let a story become comfortable before it was finished. That I kept pressing at the edges of a narrative the way you press at the edges of a wound to understand its actual depth. I had never heard my own process described that way before. Reading it, I understood she had been paying close attention long before she drove to Macon. The piece ran in the winter issue as promised. A single copy arrived by courier on a Wednesday morning in a padded envelope with a handwritten note from Selah on her personal stationery. 4 words. You earned every word. I taped the note to the wall above my desk next to the framed table of contents page from the Southern Current, the first time my name had ever appeared in print. The not yet folder on my laptop was closed now. There were no more not yets to file. My father called the day the issue released. He had ordered a subscription months earlier, he told me, before he even knew what the piece would say. He had not mentioned it because he did not want to make a thing of it. He said, I read it this morning on the porch. His voice had the quality it got on our Sunday calls when he had been sitting with something for a while before finding the words. He said, she got you right. I told him I thought she did. He said, I am going to frame it. I told him he did not have to. He said, I know I do not have to. I said, all right, Dad. Frame it. My mother called 11 days after the issue released. 11 days. I noticed the number when it came up on my screen, and the fact that I noticed it told me I had been paying more attention to the silence than I wanted to admit. She called on a Thursday afternoon. She did not do things on impulse. Everything she did, including damage, had always been deliberate. I let it ring once before answering. She said hello. I said hello. A pause that established neither of us had a script for this particular call. Then she said, I read the article. Another pause. She's a good writer, that woman. I said, yes, she is. He said, she wrote very highly of you. I said, I know. Then she said something I had no prepared response for. She said, I did not know it had gotten that far. Her voice was not warm. Not apologetic exactly. Something more stripped down than either. The voice of a person making a factual correction to a record they had been maintaining incorrectly. I could have said a great many things. I had a full inventory available, 31 years of accumulated evidence, specific dates and moments, the yellow Easter dress, the single photograph at my graduation, the Christmas dinner where MHM was the full extent of the response. I could have built a case that would have outlasted the call. Instead I said, I know you did not. That is the whole point, Mom. She did not respond immediately. I did not fill the silence. Then she said, the article is on the table. I'm not sure what to do with it. I told her that was up to her. She said, your father wants to put it on the wall. I said, I know. She said, I suppose that is fine. I said, I think it is. A shorter silence. He said, I will let you go. Then Kristin. She paused. It was good work. 3 words with some friction in them, some cost, the voice of a person for whom that sentence required more effort than it should have. It was not enough. But it was the most honest thing my mother had said to me in 31 years. Not I am proud of you. Not I am sorry. Not an acknowledgement that any of it had happened the way it had happened. Just it was good work. A door that had been shut for a very long time opening the smallest possible amount. I registered it as what it was and nothing more. I hung up and sat at my desk for a few minutes without moving. Then I opened my laptop and started working on the next piece. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 7 years old, standing in a department store in a yellow dress that would do. Being overlooked is not a verdict. It is a condition. And conditions change. The people in that yard had been looking at me through the same fixed lens for 3 decades, and that lens was not about me. It was about what they needed to believe, about the hierarchy, about the story the family had been telling itself about who mattered and in what order. I was never plain. I was just inconvenient to the version of the story they preferred. And inconvenient things, if they keep showing up and keep being real, eventually have to be accounted for. I did not need the reunion to happen. I did not need Sela to drive 90 minutes to sit at the secondary table with me. I did not need 40 people in a backyard to redirect their attention before I knew that my work had value. I had known that for years, built in rooms where nobody was watching, confirmed not by applause but by the slow weight of a byline accumulating one piece at a time. But there is something about being seen in the right place at the right moment that does not change the work itself. It changes the room. And that room had needed changing for a long time. My shoebox is still on the shelf above my desk. Inside it the composition notebooks from middle school, the not yet folder printed and folded flat, a copy of that first Southern Current table of contents and one new edition. A photograph my father took of me at the reunion without telling me, standing near the oak tree in the late afternoon light, talking to Sela, looking completely at ease, looking like someone who belongs exactly where she is. He sent it 3 days later with a text that said simply, keep this one. I printed it and put it in the box. I did not need it framed. I just needed it to exist. Proof that I was there. That the room had to reckon with me. That the story had to be corrected out loud in front of everyone who had been telling it wrong. 31 years of plain. One afternoon in August. Same girl. Finally the right room. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told. And here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.